We're back with some more ZX Spectrum goodness, and today's subject is the almighty Hewson. Hewson Consultants weren't on the same sort of tier as the likes of Ocean Software and US Gold in terms of size and commercial impact, but they were one of the strongest of the mid-level software houses. The name Hewson Consultants may well sound more like a firm that builds parts for vacuum cleaners as opposed to a company that makes computer games, but back in their prime, Hewson built up a solid reputation based on making and publishing, well, damn good games. And all original games too. We don't have any licensed titles here, and in fact we hardly have any sports titles. Just fine work, particularly from the likes of Graftgold, who published a few games through them, as well as Raffaele Cecco and others. If you bought a Hewson game, then the chances were pretty good that you were buying something different, and you may well even be buying something that's a bit of a pioneer. There's groundbreaking games put out there by Hewson in a variety of genres, whether it be arcade action, the RPG, or even the train simulator. Hewson did make games for all of the classic 8-bit micros, not to mention a few 16-bit ones, but I've decided to specifically focus on the Spectrum for this video. There's a couple of reasons. The Speccy was always Hewson's home court. Andrew Hewson, the company's founder, first made his name through releasing programming books, starting with Hints and Tips for the ZX80, and even after he formed Hewson in 1982 to release games, there'd be other books released such as 40 Best Machine Code Routines for the ZX Spectrum, as well as his regular Hewson's Helpline feature in Sinclair User, 2 pages full of programming and other assorted tips that ran monthly in the magazine for most of its duration. On the personal side of things, I played and loved a lot of Hewson's games. Back when I started on the Spectrum Plus 2A in 1990, Hewson's games were always on the cover tapes of the 3 big magazines, Your Sinclair, Crash and Sinclair User. Of course, while this was most excellent for me as a little nipper, this wasn't exactly great for Hewson. It was the time right near the end of the original company, when they were selling off their old titles to the mags in order to make any money they could. Still, it was thanks to this that the name Hewson was as familiar to me as a young'un as the likes of Codemasters and Ocean were. The times for Hewson may have been tough, but their games were obviously still good. We've got a little over 50 games here, and I'm sticking to games that were originally published by Hewson, and we'll be taking them alphabetically, although when we get to series of games we will cover those together. Some of the games here are very familiar indeed, the sort that you'll often find cited as being amongst the best computer games of the 8-bit micro years, but there's certainly other great games that have fallen through the cracks, whether they be more simple yet effective budget titles, or others that are a bit more ambitious. And it's about time we started going through them. This is the A to Z of Hewson games for the ZX Spectrum. Let's do it. We start off strong with 3 early games created by one half of the almighty Graftgold, that being Steve Turner. Graftgold and Hewson basically go hand in hand. The duo of Turner and Andrew Braybrook released games for Hewson from 1983 to 1987, and while Braybrook largely concentrated on making games for the C64, Turner made stuff for the Speccy. You almost can't go wrong with a Graftgold game, and here we're beginning with the 3 3D space combat games that make up the Seiddab trilogy. 3D Space Wars from 1983 is Steve Turner's first release title, written when he was still working in insurance. It's an early attempt at a space shooter, to be sure, one where there are 24 alien ships to kill in each wave, and after killing as many as you can when they're initially together, you've got to chase them around as they fly all over the shop. Perfectly okay stuff for the time. 3D Seiddab Attack from 1984 grounds the action. You're in a tank-type drone and you're looking to hunt down and wipe out all the aliens before they either destroy you or you run out of fuel, and there are both city and countryside stages to contend with. Again, it's not necessarily the best 3D action you can find on the Speccy at this time, but it's not bad. The third game in the Seiddab trilogy is undoubtedly the best of the lot, 1984's 3D Lunattack. We're back up in the skies again, controlling a lunar hover fighter and scouring the surfaces of the Seiddab's base, looking to blow up anything you can lay your sights on. This certainly runs a lot smoother than the earlier games, and the movement feels an awful lot nicer. My only major quibble with this and the other Seiddab games is that the shots follow your cursor even after you've fired them, which can be a little annoying seeing as you have to stay in the line of fire a little bit longer than you'd really like to. But hey, you kinda get used to it after a bit. These 3 games were later released in compilation form as the Seiddab trilogy, and they're totally okay. But Steve Turner would generally be more famous for making much deeper and more involved games than this. Indeed, it's not long at all before we return to Seiddab for something that's a lot more complex than these earlier titles. Before we get to that, however, we do have a nifty little game called Anarchy before us. This game was first released for the Commodore 64. The original guy behind it was an Australian named Michael Sentinella, and this is his only game. The Specky version here, from 1988, was coded by Dominic Robinson, who we'll be seeing a few times in this vid. He made cracking ports of C64 games to the Spectrum, and Anarchy is no exception. This title is sort of in the Boulder Dash mould, but a bit more violent. It's a top-down maze, but rather than collecting all the gems in the maze, instead you have to destroy all the blocks in the maze. You can't simply destroy blocks that are right next to you, and naturally there's enemies to avoid. You can freeze them with a well-placed shot, but you can't totally destroy them. As has been pointed out by others, a rather obscure UPL arcade game called Raiders 5 served as a clear inspiration for this title, but Anarchy might actually improve on it. The destruction element is a very neat little twist on a rather common formula, and the simple rules that are in play means that you need to think a little about how you're going to shoot down the formations of blocks, especially when you're in a tight area. Naturally, the enemies milling about and getting in the way, not to mention the time, add a lot of pressure on. It's a fine game, and it was also a budget release. Coming out on Hewson's Racket budget label, it was yours for all of £3. An absolute steal of a title at that price point, and excellent on the Spectrum. The next game in the video is the first one that is plucked right out of the top drawer, one of the most beloved titles you will find on the ZX Spectrum. Following the Seiddab trilogy, Steve Turner set to work on a wholly different kettle of fish, an adventure game that wasn't dissimilar to the likes of Ultimate's Attic Attack and Night Law, but one that was much deeper, a game steeped in myths and legends where a wizard finds and casts spells on a quest to defeat the Lord of Chaos. The wizard explores 8 levels, consisting of over 200 rooms, in order to achieve his goals. The whole process took a fair few months, but the end result was 1984's absolutely fantastic Avalon. In a 2018 interview with Graham Mason for Retro Gamer, Turner's complete change of direction from arcadey shooter action to a massive adventure was partly inspired by comments in reviews for the previous Seiddab games that were already bemoaning the large amount of shoot-em-ups that were flooding the market, and also by the success of the aforementioned Attic Attack. The clean design and speedy play of Ultimate's title was a big inspiration, and from there Turner set about creating something altogether deeper, filled with ancient British and Arthurian legend, inspired by his own love of history and fantasy. Avalon, for a 1984 British game, really manages to hit a lot of action RPG notes. You play as a wizard named Marauder, or to be more accurate, you play an astral projection of him that's flying around the various rooms, casting the spells and whatnot. You never actually die as such in this game. The projection loses life, and then when that's depleted you start again back at Marauder's physical form. However, you'll still have any spells and items that you've picked up along the way, doors will remain open, and so on. The controls are quite easy to learn, and it's all done via the joystick. You pick spells from a list, including one that actually makes you move about. You use a servant spell that you get early on to pick up items and then retrieve them from Marauder's inventory. And of course you use the joystick to battle with the various creatures knocking about. Marauder doesn't start with any offensive spells, but he will find some soon enough. Something that's also different is that enemies don't just randomly appear on screens as they do in other games of the time, like Attic Attack. They'll actually pursue you from screen to screen. And crucially, the movement is very fast. Marok glides around all over the shop, opening doors when he gets near them, and there's no in-game loading times to speak of, at all. Said fast movement is achieved by the actual Marok sprite not moving at all. Technically, you're actually moving the room about while Marok stays in the middle, and it works out quite well. Avalon is an excellent and rightly very successful game, and it's still a title that's perfectly playable today, which is no mean feat considering that it's an RPG that's over 40 years old. It can honestly be said that there was no other game remotely like this one on the Specky when it came out in 1984, and there weren't a whole lot of other titles after it on the system that could match it. Absolutely a game to play if you haven't. The success of Avalon ensured that a sequel would be coming, and Hewson released Dragontorc the following year. In Retro Gamer and in other interviews, Steve Turner described Dragontorc as one of his personal favourites. He'd already agonised over building the base and making the mechanics with Avalon, and so with Dragontorc he could purely concentrate on the adventure. The base gameplay of the game is indeed very similar, so chances are pretty good that if you like Avalon, you're already going to like this. Although there are a few cool additions. One of the big ones is that you can actually recruit people to fight for you. If you pick up a bow and then give it to one of the friendly elves, for example, they'll follow you and attack enemies. That's pretty nice, and naturally stuff like this is essential for solving the various puzzles that are kicking around, of which there are plenty, more complex than what you'd find in Avalon. It's another lovely game, and it was also quite successful, although Turner noted that the sales didn't really improve on Avalon, and in the end we never quite ended up with a trilogy of these games on the 8-bits, which is what was originally intended. There could have also been a new game in the series on PlayStation called Dragon Wrath, although this too never quite materialised. In any case, both Avalon and Dragontorc are stone cold classics, some of the best adventures you'll find on the computer, without a doubt. We may not have had a third game featuring Marok, but Turner did use the Avalon engine for something a little different. Astroclone, also from 1985. We're going back into space and back into the world of the Seiddab Empire, but for something more involved than the more traditional shoot-em-ups we've seen previously. This is a hybrid of a game. Initially, you're in your base, and the game plays like Avalon, only the servant now becomes a cursor which you use to fire your gun at enemies. This initial bit is just to get you started, mind. The core of this game is a big battle against the Seiddab, in which you have 15 clone ships at your disposal, and you assign them to the 2 star sectors next to Sol, which is your home. Once you do that, you go into those sectors and fight the battles. This bit plays like a nice and appropriately speedy version of Defender, where you need to destroy the Seiddab cruisers in the area before you can move on, gradually taking your ships forward, and ultimately getting into the Seiddab starbases, which takes you into combat on foot, Avalon style. It's all about keeping as many clone ships alive as possible, earning reinforcements, and maintaining a numbers advantage in the sectors. There's a lot going on here, but Astroclone isn't actually too tough a game to pick up and play. It's certainly a tough game in general, but it's one I would absolutely recommend. It's right up there with those more famous fantasy RPGs, although Astroclone does seem to have fallen through the cracks a little compared to Avalon and Dragontorc, and it definitely deserves more recognition. In short, you should just go ahead and play all 3 of them. Of course, they can't all be games like Avalon and Astroclone. Anyone up for some backgammon? Well, here's some backgammon from 1983, and it can even run on a 16K Spectrum, although I suppose that's not too surprising. Honestly, I don't really know how to play backgammon, so I can't tell you too much about it, although we will be seeing more significant games from Mike Mail later on, the person who coded this. I also know that even early Hewson games like this one could be found on magazine cover tapes back in 1991. This appeared on a Sinclair User Great 8 set in August of that year. And well, that's about all I've got here. Battle Valley from 1988 is another budget game from the Racket label. It's not a particularly famous one, and it's rather easy to see why. This is a shoot 'em up, although it's trying to do something a bit different. You control either a tank or a helicopter, but you can't really use both of them at once. The idea seems to be that you use the tank to eliminate the majority of ground defences that can't be blown up from the air, before then moving forward with the chopper and capturing bases, but the instructions are frustratingly unclear. It tells you all about stopping a copter and winching up items, but then doesn't actually tell you how to do the bloody things. Seeing as doing such things is essential to progressing in the game, that's kind of a problem. It's a different and slower paced take on the Silkworm formula, and the game's music is actually really good. I can see some potential in it, but in the end it doesn't quite hit the target, and the seminal conversion of the aforementioned Silkworm the following year basically wiped this out of existence. Ugh, City Slicker. There really aren't that many bad games at all in this video, but this is definitely one of them. This is a platformer from 1986, and it's from the same folks who made the much more famous Technician Ted, which we'll be seeing later on, a little outfit called Search. Technician Ted is well renowned for its difficulty, but City Slicker is a whole other level of frustrating. This is filled with all the typical things you would expect from a micro-platformer, but without any of the actually good bits, and indeed this adds some awfulness that's all of its own. There's the chore of collecting various items in an arcade adventure style, something that honestly makes the tasks in Technician Ted appear inviting by comparison, and all the usual stuff like not being able to touch anything, every jump requiring damn near perfection, or being damaged when you fall any further than 6 inches. But the absolute worst thing is that losing energy decreases the height of your jumping. This is, well, ghoulish. Essentially makes progress impossible. You can refill your energy by consuming items that appear, but what good's that when you can't actually reach them? This is a detestable, absolute wretch of a game, easily Hewson's worst on the 8-bits. It got scathing notes at the time for the sadistic gameplay, its ugly graphics, and even its rather edgy premise, an urban terror type affair where you have to defuse bombs in the city that have been set by a rather stereotypical figure named Abreu. Naturally, you get a lengthy game over sequence if you fail, which you will be seeing a lot, thus making it even more annoying. In short, there is nothing good about this one whatsoever. Complete and utter shit. Fortunately, we can wash the taste of City Slickers out of our mouth with 2 more of Hewson's most famous releases. It's time for Cybernoid, and it's time to introduce a man named Raffaele Cecco. Cecco is undoubtedly Hewson's biggest star coder, and that was pretty much by design. Hewson made a big fin in the mags of getting Raffaele Cecco to make games for them after he left the struggling Microgen, and he most certainly ended up delivering. Hell, they even released a compilation entirely consisting of his titles, the Cecco Collection, and while we're not introducing him through his first game, we begin by looking at his most famous specky game, 1988 Cybernoid, the Ultimate Fighting Machine. Or simply Cybernoid. Cybernoid is in many ways an evolution of 1986's Equinox, a pretty damn good game that Cecco made for Microgen when he was a mere 19 years old. Just as in Equinox, you fly your droid through the levels, all three of which consist of multiple screens and are chock full of enemies, missiles and other assorted bullet-spewing fortifications. Although Cybernoid does have a fair few special tools at his disposal to take care of them, whether it's bombs, a shield or various power-ups. Ideally, you also collect a bunch of cargo from the levels along the way and complete them inside the time limit. It's actually appropriate that we look at Cybernoid straight after looking at City Slickers. In 1986, City Slickers was already considered to be a hopelessly out-of-date affair, a bloated flick-screen platformer, and ultimately a piss-poor game. Cybernoid, on the other hand, is a much sleeker, leaner package. Even if you're flying around as opposed to jumping, the game is just as much of a platformer as it is a shoot-'em-up, and it is still flick-screen. Cecco preferred the flick-screen style, believing it played better to the Speccy's advantages, and Cybernoid, along with the earlier Exolon, which we'll cover soon, showed that you could keep to that style and still make something that really felt state-of-the-art without the use of scrolling. The bright and memorable graphics and excellent music also help matters a lot, but Cecco's games really feel like a proper evolution of the formula that was honed by the likes of Matthew Smith years earlier. And of course, like those games, Cybernoid is also rock hard. You will die an awful lot indeed, and the challenge is brutal from the beginning. But as tough as it is, it's one of those games where the difficulty level is worth wrestling with, one that deserved all the success that it got. It was the sort of title that Specky owners pointed to with pride, even so far into the computer's existence, as something that could compete with games that were coming out on the Amiga and the ST. And you can't blame them at all for championing the title so hard. Cybernoid 2 The Revenge quickly followed on the heels of the original, coming out only a few months later in 1988. And, yep, it's a pretty good sequel. It's generally more of the same, of course. If you enjoyed mastering the 3 levels of the original Cybernoid, you're undoubtedly going to have just as good a time getting to grips with this sequel, where we've got 4 more levels of phenomenally difficult blasting and navigation to get through. The graphics are as good as ever, we've still got fine music to take us through the game, and you're going to get battered and blown up aplenty. While this sequel obviously doesn't do a lot different, you can hardly blame Hewson and Cecco. Cecco had already nailed the formula with the first game, and there wasn't an awful lot of need to change things. I definitely prefer the original Cybernoid to this sequel, but really it's just a matter of personal preference. Both of them are very good, and they're definitely good representatives for the spectrum. Indeed, Cecco's games really didn't feel right on any other platform but the Spectrum, as was kind of evidenced when the original Cybernoid made its way to the likes of the Amiga, and even to the NES. They're classics, but they're undoubtedly ZX Spectrum classics, as opposed to any other platform. Once again, we move from a rightly famous title to a couple of lesser-known affairs, the first being Di-Lithium Lift from 1983 by Simon Cobb. This 16K title is a pretty fast and furious one. You have to collect the dilithium crystals on the grid, but you have to avoid the 4 lasers that are on the outside, constantly hunting you down. It's a simple affair, but it's a damn difficult one. It's a little bit like Jeff Minter's seminal Gridrunner, although our poor hero here doesn't have any attacks to speak of. In fact, it's even closer to an early Ocean game called Transversion, written by Christian Urquhart, and to be honest, the Ocean game is far better. There's a simple and short-lived bit of fun to be had here when you're just bashing your head against the wall, but the rather basic nature of it does let it down. Oddly enough, while the copyright for this game dates it to 1983, I can't really find reviews for this game until the middle of 1984. If that's when this 16K title was actually released, I can understand why the critique for the game was rather scathing, as it feels pretty outdated for that time. We're going back to board games with Draughts Genius, another racket budget title. This one's from 1987. Amusingly enough, this take on Draughts is actually by Raffaele Cecco. Not exactly one of his most famous games, but there you go. Anyway, this is a perfectly fine take on good old Draughts. The graphics are about as nice as you can get for a Spectrum Draughts game, and it plays totally okay. What is amusing about this is that it is perhaps the closest that Hewson ever came to a licensed game, seeing as you're playing against Albert Einstein. Hewson never did tie-in games, as Andrew Hewson wasn't a big fan of them and much preferred original ideas, but we do have a clearly real person to play against here, and he's even called Einstein on the back of the cassette. Mind you, it doesn't appear as though Hewson got the rights to use Einstein's image from the notoriously highly litigious estate. Or at least I can't find those details anywhere on the inlay. So it's probably a good thing that Draughts Genius wasn't a big hit or anything. I do remember playing it on a crash cover tape, mind you, so it gets a thumbs up from me. It also gets a thumbs up for the silly dance that Einstein does when he inevitably wins. Next, we've got Eliminator from 1989. We're pretty late in the life of Hewson, and this here's a game that was originally on 16-bit platforms. It was coded for the Atari ST by John Phillips, who's most famous for Nebulus, and it looks like this was converted to both the Speccy and Amstrad by Chris Wildsmith, with Phillips providing support. This is a pretty cool rail shooter that's somewhat in the Space Harrier vein, although for the most part your ship travels on the ground, occasionally using ramps that will either provide a jumping point, or occasionally flip your ship onto the ceiling. That's quite a nifty touch. You'll often need to use these ramps to avoid the roadblocks that are dotted around the levels, although these can be destroyed sometimes. It is a tough game, as is often the norm, but it's a good conversion from 16-bit to 8-bit, and there's also some decent in-game music. And hey, while it's not a Spectrum original, it's always nice to see a very cool game that originated on the ST. Contrary to the discourse that's often found out in the wild, a lot of good stuff came from the platform. There's a lot of damn fine games in this video, but if I had to pick my favourite Hewson game, well, it absolutely has to be 1987's Exolon. The first Hewson game made by Raffaele Cecco, Exolon is a flick-screen run-and-gun game, something that may seem a bit odd considering that these sorts of games always scroll. However, Exolon is a game that plays to all of ZX Spectrum's strengths. As previously mentioned, Cecco's earlier Equinox for Microgen is the game where you see his style take form. The gameplay here has more in common with Cybernoid, but the art style is already there, and indeed there's quite a lot of sprites and what have you in Equinox that would then appear in Exolon. You play as a thoroughly tooled up soldier named Vitorc, and the screens in each level always present you with a different challenge, whether there's lots of enemies to shoot, different paths to take, a bit of jumping, or other obstacles and fortifications that need to be blown up with missiles. It's a slower affair than the average run-and-gunner, but it's all about careful movement and good timing. Your ammo is limited, so you can't always go around blasting all the time, and you're often stuck in situations where you need to move sharpish, say if there's a homing missile coming at you and you need to blow up the brain controlling it. The graphics are absolutely tremendous. They're not too busy, but everything just really pops with colour. It's one of the best examples I can think of when it comes to the Speccy's colours being so vivid. And of course, at around the halfway point through each stage, you can don the almighty Exolon outfit. It's satisfying in that this allows you to walk through mines and certain other obstacles with impunity, although you're certainly not fully invulnerable. This is a game that I absolutely love. My favourite Hewson title, my favourite Raffaele Cecco title, and one of my favourites on the Spectrum. It widely got a lot of positive reviews and big sales, essentially making Cecco into a household name on the computer. And that was most certainly well deserved. Bloody brilliant. Hewson aren't particularly known for their text adventures, but they do have two of them for the Specky. Here's the first of them, Fantasia Diamond from 1984. This Kim Topley penned quest sees you attempt to claim the eponymous diamond, and according to write-ups it features a fair bit of interaction with other characters that are moving around the world, as opposed to the more basic verb-noun puzzles you might find in a more bog-standard game. Admittedly, text adventures are not my strong suit, but the game did get some decent write-ups, and it even won an award at the Grand Prix International du Logiciel d'Aventure, despite not being written in French. So it may well be of interest for those who enjoy a slice of interactive fiction. It's about time for a good, honest, old-fashioned ZX Spectrum arcade adventure, the signature genre of the 8-bit micros. And Hewson does have a pretty good one of those for us. Here's Firelord, a game by Stephen Crow. This fits right in with the likes of Robin of the Wood or Feud. You're a knight named Sir Galahad, exploring a big old map, and you're looking for spells that'll help you knock all these enemies spark out and set you on your way to recovering the 4 charms that'll bring back the Firestone to the kingdom. Much like Avalon, you are initially defenceless, but you'll soon pick up spells that you can fight back with. However, rather than simply magicking the hell out of random enemies and finding pieces of a holy goblet or privy or whatever, the core of Firelord is all about interaction with people, specifically trading items. You find random crap out in the world, you take it to shops, and you barter for the items you actually need for your quest, presenting deals and getting offers and all of that. Of course, you can also nick the items if you want, although you will get hauled in front of a judge and likely executed a couple of times if you're caught. If you're a fan of this classic and quite speedy sort of micro-adventure, then this is definitely a game for you. Firelord is a very good example of the form indeed. Gunrunner from 1987 is another run and gunner, as the title might suggest, although this one's a bit more of a standard affair than Exolon, a monochrome title with scrolling and the like. It's, well, a perfectly okay game, really. Your hero gets a decent bunch of power-ups, including a jetpack and the like, but it is all a bit too grey, and it is one of those games where there's several different sets of enemies, and it's a random choice as to which ones come hurtling towards you. Kind of like Uridium in that regard, but I think Uridium does that sort of thing a bit better. It's half decent, but it ain't gonna trump Exolon. Interestingly, this is a game by Cyberdyne, Christian Urquhart's independent outfit. Unlike other Cyberdyne games, this one did get a proper commercial release, although it's the only specky one that they did for Hewson. Oddly, they may be more known for games that could have been lost if it weren't for cover tapes, gems like the fantastic Bobby Yaz show. Mike Mail is a name you may remember from earlier in this video because, well, he did a version of Backgammon. I wouldn't normally highlight a programmer just for doing a version of Backgammon, but Mail made several titles for Hewson, and he's certainly their most niche programmer. His focus would be on transport sims. We've still got a while to go for his 2 most famous ones that would take place on the ground, but here we've got Heathrow International Air Traffic Control from 1984. There's 2 versions of air traffic control, although I've gone for the international version because it's the same, only the B-side replaces Heathrow with Schiphol. This isn't the easiest of games to grasp now, seeing as it's dots on a screen, but it is the sort of game where things can most definitely go wrong in an instant, and you could easily end up breaking badding the hell out of a couple of planes if you don't concentrate on giving out the right directions. The age of something like this may show, but it got good reviews at the time, and it's worth some respect. Impossaball hails from 1987, and it's another game from John Phillips. This one was released in early 1987, a little while before his smash hit Nebulus. This isn't a hugely well-known game nowadays, but it is a very good one even if it is also quite literally balls hard. You control a bouncing ball in a 3D space, and you've got to smash the cylinders on the track back into the ground or the ceiling, avoiding all the obstacles and doing it in time. Any game where you play as a bouncing ball is usually going to be tough as hell, although Impossaball does offer a little bit more control over the ball than the likes of Cauldron 2 do. There's a few different heights you can bounce at, and it's not too long before the game becomes more about overcoming the obstacles than it does wrestling with the controls, where hitting those cylinders feels satisfying and the game actually moves at a decent clip. I really like this. Very difficult, but it feels rewarding. We've got another stranger title next, Into Africa. From the copyright date, this game was originally made in 1987, but it didn't actually surface until 1989, coming out for the budget Racket label. This is an adventure game where you're trying to unite the different tribes of an unnamed African country before invaders from another country, who have also stolen a treasured golden mask, take the whole place over. You control 5 different people, all of whom have specific abilities that make it necessary to keep them alive on this little adventure. It feels a little like The Lords of Midnight, only with a more modern hue. It's an intriguing game, really. There's not much at all else like it in the Hewson back catalogue, and I can't help but wonder if there's a strange backstory behind it, what with it being held back for so long. Was it meant to be a full price title? Possibly for another software house? It's the sort of thing that would have benefited from a full price package, a more in-depth manual that makes the whole task and commands a little bit clearer and makes the experience a bit more vivid. As it is, it's definitely one of Hewson's more obscure releases. It only got a couple of reviews at the time, and they were pretty mediocre. Not the best game, but a curious one. Hewson, in their later years, released a lot of compilations. While this was generally true of most software houses, Hewson really were chucking them out there, and one of their most curious ones was a 1990 release called Fourth Dimension. Why curious? Well, you've got the 1988 Mastertronic game Roll Around. Hewson and Mastertronic had a business relationship and they did run the Racket label together, and then you've got 3 games that are coming out for the first time. The Fourth Dimension releases on other platforms also featured other original titles, including the C64 version of Cyberdyne's brilliant Headler Ball, as well as Insects in Space, an excellent Defender clone that was knocked up by the almighty Sensible Software. Certainly an odd compilation, and as for the original games on the Specky version, they're a mixed bag. We do start with the one that is by far the best, however. This game here is Klimax. Coded by Rui Tito, it's a title of Portuguese origin, and it's an isometric game where you need to push egg-like bombs around, shoving them into machines called nuclear power units, and blowing them the hell up. It's a little obscure and tough to get to grips with at first, but it soon clicks. It can be frustrating, especially when certain enemies keep blowing the bombs up before you can reach your destination, but it's nice, bright, and likeable. It kind of reminds me of the sort of game that Costa Panay's Vortex Software would make. It does feel of the same ilk as the likes of the classic Highway Encounter. Anywho, it's a really good game. It's been many years since I last played this back when it was on a YS cover tape, and it was good to see the title again. Night Driver is another pretty early game, this time from 1984, and they can't all be winners. This is a simple top-down driving game where you've simply got to get from one end of the track to the other, but the keyboard controls do make that pretty bloody painful. It's all too sensitive, and the game is very much in your face, stopping to shout at you essentially every time you crash into anything. And trust me, you'll be doing a lot of crashing, especially if you try and do this at any kind of speed. This sort of thing isn't something that's aged well at all, although it doesn't appear to have got particularly good write-ups back then. It's certainly not worth booting up now. The guy who made this, Clive Brooker, did go on to some much cooler games, mind you, particularly One Man and His Droid, one of the many gems of Mastertronic's budget catalogue. We've got the second Specky title from the Fourth Dimension compilation, and it's Kraal. This is another game of Portuguese origin and, well, it's a lot worse than Klimax, being a pretty frustrating and deathly slow top-down tank game where you move around hunting for aliens that appear once in a blue moon, or gems that may appear when you blow up certain creatures. The presentation is kind of promising, and there's some average in-game music going on, but the game itself just feels very clunky indeed. To be honest, it's the sort of game that you often think of when you see that it was exclusive to a compilation, in that there was probably a damn good reason as to why the game wasn't actually fully released on its own. But considering the original games that were on the C64 Fourth Dimension compilation, it's fair to say that the Specky and Amstrad got the shitty end of the stick this time around. Thankfully, we have a much better tank 'em up coming up next, Marauder from 1988. We've got a quality name on this production. Keith Burkill, the main man behind some fabulous arcade conversions including Space Harrier, Commando, Ghosts and Goblins and Galaxy Force is on this one, and it's nice to see him on an original game, this one coming from his own little label, KCB Games. Marauder is as smooth and silky as you would expect from a game that Burkill made, feeling like a top-down shooter with arcade pedigree, even if the graphics aren't on that level. There's plenty of blasting to be found here as you take on the role of Captain CT Cobra and take on another evil empire in pursuit of some jewels. The game certainly got a bit of challenge, and while there is the bit of occasional bullshit such as power downs that result in you losing a life, it's generally a fair title, and I really can't complain much about a game that is essentially another take on ZX Spectrum Commando, only inside a big old tank. Marauder appears to have been a decent hit by all accounts. It's certainly got a bunch of excellent reviews, including that ever desirable Crash Smash. A top quality ZX shooter and no mistake. Back to the early days now, and here we've got Maze Chase from 1983. No prizes for guessing what this is. It's a Pac-Man clone. As far as such games go, there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It's a 16K title and the play is thoroughly average. The controls do take a bit of getting used to, but there's a lot of games from these early years that use the number row for controls, as horrifying as that may sound. The man who coded this is John Hardman, who was also the co-writer on 40 Best Machine Code Routines for the ZX Spectrum alongside Andrew Hewson. And in fact, this wasn't his first shot at a Pac-Man clone. Hewson did make a few games for the ZX81 in the very beginning, including a Pac-Man clone called Puckman and a Space Invaders game, but unfortunately the majority of Hewson's ZX81 programs aren't out there. We've got another Pac-Man type game here, but this one's much nicer. Here's Maze Mania from 1989, coded by a little outfit called Gamesman Software. This one's a lot more like Pac-Mania. It's top down, but the camera is closer in and our hero is able to jump over enemies. There are some differences too. The aim here, rather than eating up pellets, is to change the colour of all the tiles, so we kind of have the addition of Q*bert-esque play into the mix, especially seeing as some titles will continually switch between colours when Flippo, for that is our hero's name, touches them. The graphics are probably the most special thing here, because I'm honestly not sure if there's a Pac-Man type game on the Specky that's a better looker than this one. This is absolutely lovely, with beautiful use of colour and some nice animations to boot, all while moving at a decent clip, and then the gameplay's no slouch either. A very nice Hewson game, and one that I actually wasn't aware of before doing this video right here. Definitely something I can recommend highly. Here we go then with another pretty big one. It's time for 1987's Nebulus, a game that you may also know as Castellian, Tower Toppler, Corochanland or Sublime, depending on where and how you played it. While the game was originally a smash on the C64, according to an interview for Antstream with coder John Phillips, the idea actually first took form as a demo on the ZX Spectrum that was somewhat inspired by the smash hit Uridium, another game we'll get to later, only using a horizontal cylinder that rotated as opposed to traditional scrolling. Phillips would then take the idea to the Commodore, where it was developed over a few months with a lot of useful input from Andrew Hewson himself, but the game was such a big hit that it ended up getting loads of conversions. There were even versions for the NES, Game Boy and Atari 7800. And of course we've got the Specky version here, which was made by Phillips himself. The idea is to take your frog-like creature named Pogo up from his submarine to the top of each tower so that you can blow them up, while naturally various creatures try to stop you. Pogo can't actually be killed directly by these creatures, but they do knock him down and he will drown if he hits the water. Although there are points where you will need to be knocked down a touch in order to find the right path. It's a game where you do need a little bit of patience from time to time, even if the time limit is strict, and it plays perfectly fine on the Spectrum. It's certainly not the best version of the game, but you still get cool, satisfying bits like the tower sinking rapidly into the sea once you finish the level. It's kind of a weird one, this. I feel like I have to be in the right mind for Nebulus, as sometimes playing it annoys the hell out of me, but other times it works out just fine. I can't exactly knock the game's popularity, and I'm sure it must be amongst Hewson's most successful games, if not the company's most successful game full stop. I would imagine it's between this, Paradroid and Uridium. Up next, we have Netherworld. This one's from 1988, and it's another game that originally started life on the Commodore 64, produced by the Finnish coder Jukka Tapanimäki, and converted here to the Spectrum by Chris Wood. The premise of the game is pretty cool. It's a Boulder Dash type game, only one that's much more like a shoot 'em up, where you have to rush around and collect all the gems, but you can also blast enemies while doing it, earning the odd important power-up such as the ability to break through a wall. You move around very quickly, and there's also teleports that you're going to need to use here and there. While the premise is cool, I think this game is a bit too unfair. Not for any controls or enemy-based reasons, but because the timer is so bloody strict that you basically can't put a foot wrong, even from the very beginning. While you obviously shouldn't be given all the time in the world for the game like this one, Netherworld does feel a bit like bashing your head against the wall from the get-go, and that lets it down a little. Still a cool idea, mind. I also like the fun factoid about this game, as mentioned by Andrew Hewson himself in an interview with RVG. The face on the game's front cover is actually that of the man behind the game, the idea being based on the game literally coming out of Jukka's head. Apparently Jukka didn't know he was going to be on the cover until the final cover art was revealed. Between the programming books and the name Hewson Consultants, which Andrew Hewson has stated simply came from him previously doing consultancy work back in the 70s, Hewson's early work does make it seem like their overall output would be much more, shall we say, staid compared to what they'd later come up with. Mike Mail was one of the first major talents they found, and his work kind of sums that up. Here we have the two Nightflite games from 1982 and 1983, both of which were sequels to his earlier Pilot, which came out for the ZX81. This is quite an early example of the form on pretty damn underpowered hardware compared to, say, Microsoft Flight Simulator 1.0, also from 1982, and while they most certainly show their age, seeing as they're mainly just groups of dots on the screen that kind of take the form of a runway, it's intriguing to see such an early flight sim in action on a 16K speccey. One handy feature is the inclusion of a demonstration, so you can see just what a decent landing looks like, and more importantly than that, you can see the game in full flow, as opposed to watching me hammer hopelessly away at a 40-year-plus vintage game in a genre that I admittedly am completely useless at. While these 16K flight sims may not look like much now, these games did get half-decent write-ups back in their time. Pyracurse from 1986 is an isometric adventure game, kind of in a similar vein to the likes of Denton Design's Great Escape and Where Time Stood Still, although it's generally not as well thought of as those titles. Mark Goodall and Steve Prosser's game sees you attempt to guide 4 adventurers out of an antechamber, and naturally all 4 of them have different abilities that necessitate keeping them healthy and out of trouble. The game does get bonus points for one of these playable characters being a dog called Frosby, who's naturally good at digging up buried objects. This is the sort of game that takes a little bit of time to get to grips with, and it's not necessarily something that's aged the best, but it may well be of interest if you like those aforementioned Denton titles, and you fancy chancing your arm at leading this ragtag group about and trying not to get yourself killed by all the monsters kicking around. Graftgold, as has already been seen, could scarcely put a foot wrong in the 80s. But if there were 2 games that really summed up just how good Steve Turner and Andrew Braybrook were as a duo, it's hard to look beyond Paradroid and Quazatron because of how wonderfully they complement each other. Paradroid came first, of course. Braybrook's exceptional 1985 game where you have to destroy all the other droids on a spaceship by grappling with them and taking them over was considered one of the best C64 games ever from the moment it arrived on the market, and that standing hasn't really changed in 40 years. While Braybrook was working on Paradroid, Turner was writing an isometric graphics engine that was inspired by the Filmation engine Ultimate debuted with Nightlaw. This would be known as Ziggurat, and rather than making a straight conversion of Paradroid to the speccey, this engine would be used for 1986's Quazatron, a game with very similar mechanics to Paradroid, but one with graphics that played a lot more to the strengths of the ZX Spectrum. There are other differences between Paradroid and Quazatron beyond the graphics. Here you're always playing as the same droid called Klepto, and the action takes place in futuristic cities. Klepto doesn't completely take over a drone in the same way that Paradroid's influence device does. Once you've defeated another droid in combat, you take parts from them and become stronger that way, although if you only just manage to scrape through a grapple, there is more chance of those parts becoming damaged and unusable. One of the cuter parts is how Klepto's energy is represented by his expression, which changes to a frown if he's starting to get low on power. This is always decreasing, and you'll end up going back to the default layout if it drops to 0, although there are ways to recharge. And while you can shoot droids if you happen to have a weapon, just as in Paradroid, it's also possible to ram them and make them fall from a great height, destroying droids that way. The progression in this game is beautiful. You start off so weak and only capable of destroying the bog standard 9 rated droids, but it's so great when you become strong and you can take out the level 2 and 1 elite droids that whiz around everywhere, not to mention the special ST programmers and androids that are, of course, named after the Graftgold duo. Both Paradroid and Quazatron are fabulous indeed, and it's hard to really say which one's better. As much as Paradroid is the original, Quazatron is naturally the one I've played an awful lot more. Honestly, it's hard to think of one without the other, and it's a shame that Graftgold's approach here when it came to the speccey and the C64 didn't happen more often. A quick note. The sequel to Quazatron, 1988's Magnetron, did start development whilst Graftgold was still working with Hewson. However, the game was ultimately released by Telecomsoft after Graftgold jumped ship to them in 1987. This wasn't exactly a straightforward affair, and there was a bit of a legal tussle between Hewson and Telecomsoft over the rights to the game, but Hewson weren't able to sustain such a fight in the courts for all that long. Quest Adventure from 1983 is another text adventure from Kim Topley, where again a lot of the focus appears to be on interacting with other characters in the world rather than simply solving puzzles, although this one does feel a bit more basic and generally smaller than Fantasia Diamond. Again, I do have to be honest and say that text adventures really aren't my thing, so what you're seeing probably isn't doing the game a lot of justice. It's mostly aimlessly wandering about and hoping that another character pops up, and then failing to enter the appropriate word combination. At least that's what it is when I play it. Text adventures weren't really Hewson's thing either. Kim Topley's two games are the only two examples of the form that Hewson put out there, although both of them got a totally decent critique, even if this isn't on the level of the sort of thing that Level 9 or Infocom or whoever were putting out there. Graftgold is here once again, and this time it's Ranarama from 1987. Steve Turner's title here, I believe, is the last game that Graftgold released for Hewson. We've got a title in the hack and slash genre here, but Ranarama is a lot more deeper and involved than simply being a take on Gauntlet. You need to guide our wizard hero Mervyn, who's been turned into a frog, through the different levels of a dungeon. You have offensive, defensive and effect spells at your disposal, there's lots of enemies and projectiles kicking around, and each level contains warlocks that you need to find and defeat. You take these on in a game of ritual combat in which you have to rearrange the letters and spell out the game's title, and defeating them allows you to obtain runes which you can then use to create spells and make your character stronger. There's a little bit of progression to this game from Quazatron, the mechanics are a little similar. Much like that game, what you have here is something that ends up being very satisfying to play through. Naturally, you start off as an utter weakling with the most basic spells, but it's certainly nice when you level up a bit and then cruise through battles. But again, there is always an element of danger. If you don't maintain your psychic energy levels, it's possible to become immortal, and if that happens, well, you're in big trouble. Again, it's a fabulous game. These guys just don't make bad ones. Honestly, it's hard to find another outfit in the 8-bit era that was as utterly, consistently good as Graftgold. Ranarama perhaps isn't quite as well known as some of their other hits. Steve Turner felt that at the time it got incorrectly categorised as being just one of the many Gauntlet clones that were kicking around, but it is just as highly recommended as anything else the studio did. We've got another two slabs of transport here, and this time we're on the rails for what are surely Francis Bourgeois' two favourite games of all time. Here's Southern Belle and Evening Star from 1985 and 1987. These are most certainly Mike Mell's most famous titles, and in both of them you're in charge of a steam train. You need to make sure the King Arthur Class 460 is fully stacked with coal and water, watch those signals, make the stops and all that sort of thing, whether you're travelling from London Victoria to Brighton or Bath to Bournemouth. Again, there's a demo mode so that you can see the game running as it should, which I am thankful for. While obviously the frame rate is quite slow, to the point of it actually being a single frame a second, the graphics here are definitely much more appealing than they were in the likes of Nightflite. What's very curious is how early these games are in a pretty damn niche genre. There had been more arcadey games involving trains before this, the likes of Super Locomotive by Sega, but I am pretty sure that Southern Belle is, by a long distance, the first flat-out train simulator game that was available to the Western market. I'm not sure if it's the first outright, as I don't know what train sim games were out there on Japanese computers at the time, but this is quite a pioneer. And hell, it's not just a train sim, it's a steam train sim, not a modern train. Even nowadays, there's not exactly a lot of games out there that are trying to accurately simulate the operation of a steam locomotive. Mike Mail's games, nearly 40 years later, are still pretty close to just being on their own. In a similar vein to the earlier Maze Chase, 1983's Spectral Panic is another rather simple classic arcade clone by John Hardman. In this instance, the subject is the lesser spotted Space Panic, as opposed to the likes of Space Invaders or Frogger. It's speedy like Maze Chase, but pretty simple on the whole. Eat yourself some fruit and dig holes for the bugs to fall down into so that you can murder them. Controls are as annoying as they usually are in older games of this vintage, although it does kind of end up being weirdly close to WASD, even if it's also completely wrong. Nothing particularly noteworthy here, and Hewson didn't really do a lot of arcade clone games in the end. Probably for the best, as other setups like Ocean definitely fared a lot better in that department. We've had all the other Raffaele Cecco specky games, and now it's time for his last two outings on the computer. It's the two Stormlord games, starting with the 1989 original. We've ditched the sci-fi trappings of the likes of Exolon and Cybernoid for a more fantastical setting in which our eponymous hero must free the fairies before night falls and they're destroyed by an evil queen. In order to do this, he throws weapons about and solves the odd item-based puzzle, and unlike the previous Cecco titles, this is a scrolling game, a quite smooth scroller at that. Stormlord is essentially an attempt to make as 16-bit feeling a title as it's possible to make on the old Spectrum, and it does triumph in some departments. It's most certainly very nice looking, you've even got a bit of an edgy touch, what with the odd bits of breast milling about, and there's certainly lots going on, mostly without any slowdown. The only trouble is, well, it's just not that fun of a game to play. The puzzle side of Stormlord is what kind of lets the game down for me, because while they're not exactly complex things, it's full of crappy little gotchas that, if you fall foul of them, end up making levels unwinnable. If you accidentally open a fake door, or put a honeypot in the wrong place or whatever. And honestly, I find that sort of thing really annoying. People didn't find it annoying at the time, it should be said. This got massive reviews all around. Of course, it was a majorly hyped title. Cecco wrote a whole programming log for Crash detailing its development, and it is certainly one of the last original releases for the Specky to really get much momentum. Hell, it even ended up getting a version for the Mega Drive, although Razorsoft's take on the game was terrible. You can even play it on the frickin' Oric, thanks to some dedicated fans who made a version of it back in 2010. But yeah, I must confess that this one isn't my favourite. There was also a special demo of the game for Your Sinclair, featuring one small yet still quite difficult exclusive level. Notably, the character you play as here is a little different and smaller than the guy you play as in the final game. There would, however, be a sequel. 1990's Stormlord 2 Deliverance isn't anywhere near as famous as the first game, which is a shame because it's a hell of a lot better. This is Cecco's final flin with the Specky before making his switch over to the 16-bits, not to mention his final flin with Hewson, and he absolutely pulls out all the stops. Everything's a lot bigger, including the hero himself, we're still scrolling quite nicely, and it still looks top-notch. Happily, Deliverance does change the main thing that was annoying about the original. Puzzles are completely out of the window, and this one's all about action. Stormlord also gets a new ability in that he can triple jump, and there's lots of sub-weapons kicking about. Bombs, arrows, and all sorts. This does feel more like a true successor to Exolon, a game that's always throwing something a bit different at you, occasionally stopping for a bigger battle and just, well, being a damn good time. As much as I don't like the original Stormlord, I think this sequel's fab and definitely worth playing. Also, it's got some cracking title music thanks to Dave Rogers, who was also responsible for the fine specky music in games like Cybernoid 1 and 2, Battle Valley, and Marauder. The intro song here is my favourite of his though. It should be noted that Stormlord 2, released in May of 1990, was the last game that Hewson released for the ZX Spectrum. The original company would close its doors in 1991 after the funding well finally ran dry, although Andrew would open up his next company, 21st Century Entertainment, mere weeks after the end of Hewson. We've got one more game from 1990's Fourth Dimension compilation, and it's Super Cup Football. Hewson, unlike a lot of other UK studios, hardly released any sports games. Much like licensed games, it just doesn't seem to have been their thing. And so it's perhaps no surprise that 1. The single football game in this video was released in a compilation, as opposed to being a standalone title, and 2. Super Cup Football isn't very good. It's a quite basic top-down game of footy with very little going on graphically, and it doesn't even really get the rules of the game right. You kick the ball back into play instead of throwing it in, for example, and this does mean that you can score directly from a throw-in, which is amusing. Now, I've played many terrible football games in my time, and this one, well, it's certainly total rubbish, but it's far from being the worst of them. It's mainly just a quite dumb game where you hammer the button a lot and push forward, and you do tend to get lots of goals out of it at least. Certainly a bad football game, but not a criminal one. This isn't Gazza's Super Soccer, which, as it happens, was also made by the same person who coded this game. In the case of a little outfit called Search, we didn't necessarily have the best of times with the first game by them that we looked at in this video. That was City Slickers. However, now we're looking at their hit game, Technician Ted from 1985. The Search duo consists of Steve Marsden and Dave Cook, and here we have a micro-platformer in the very classic vein. Flick screens, all sorts of random objects flying about, tough jumps wherever you go, and a bunch of tasks that you have to complete. Ted, our techie hero, must complete these by touching objects on a screen in sequence, occasionally doing it inside a time limit, and there is a certain order to these jobs. As the instructions say, you make your way from the entrance of the chip factory to the silicone slice store, and then progress from there. This game was a hit, and probably one of the most famous of the specky micro-platformers outside of Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy, but my word, this is a brutal game indeed. There is a certain fun to be had in Technician Ted as far as just fooling around and exploring goes. The graphics, items, the room names are all very creative indeed, but it does become very frustrating whenever you actually try and complete a task, because even the smallest of mistakes will see you punished. And there are, of course, plenty of points where you can get yourself into a death loop, which will quickly see poor Ted get fired and drop-kicked into a bin. The jumping is also a little tough to get used to if you're used to the likes of Manic Miner. Ted can't quite go to the edge of a platform in the same way that Miner Willy can, and as smooth as he is, the jump feels much slower and trickier to judge. In short, this is a red-flagged title, for experts only. I do like the game a lot, and it was probably the first Hewson title I ever played, seeing as it was on my first Crash cover tape from December 1990, but good heavens, it is one hell of a challenge. Seeing as this game was a hit, it didn't take long for a couple of other TED-based games to arrive. However, the actual sequel, 1985's Costa Capers, was published by Telecomsoft instead of Hewson. Still, Marsden and Cook did return to make a special 1-8K version of Technician Ted in 1986, Technician Ted The Megamix. there's quite a lot added here. Naturally, there's a whole bunch of other rooms that even go outside of the factory, where you can find such things as a university, a big radio tower, and even a cruise missile, but the old rooms have largely had a big doing over. There's many more weird objects getting in the way, including a Sinclair C5, and helpfully all the tasks are now numbered so that you don't have to guess at the order you need to do them in. That's certainly handy. The game is still absolutely rock hard, of course, one of the very toughest that you'll find on the ZX Spectrum, but if you fancy your chances at conquering the savagery that is Technician Ted, then I'd go ahead and play this Megamix version. The classical music is even less annoying here, although you will still probably want to turn it off before too long. We've got one more Graftgold game, and it's a big deal. This is Uridium from 1986. Originally, this came out on the C64. Designed by Andrew Braybrook as something of a cross between Defender and Zaxxon, and given its name thanks to an employee named Robert Orchard getting the name of the element Iridium on, it's an absolute beaut of a shooter where you fly over the Dreadnought and destroy as much as you can before landing and initiating the self-destruct sequence before flying away as the whole thing blows up. It's another Graftgold classic, and a smash hit that ended up getting lots of conversions, including one to the NES, where it served as the licensed game for The Last Starfighter. And here we've got a pretty good Spectrum conversion thanks to Dominic Robinson, one of Hewson's in-house programmers who would later jump fully over to Graftgold, picking up and smashing out their fabulous conversion of Flying Shark for Telecomsoft in a matter of weeks. While Uridium is obviously never going to be as buttery smooth on the Spectrum as it is on the C64, and it does miss out on a couple of things including the big old self-destruct sequence, all the important stuff is present and correct, whether it's smashing up the ship or avoiding those dreaded Uridium mines, as well as possibly seeing if you can stay flying around beyond the call to land now and destroy some tougher ships for more points, if you think you're hard enough. With all of that being in place, it's pretty easy to love this classic and thoroughly challenging space blaster. It's the sort of microcomputer game that could have easily, with a graphical glow-up, gone into the arcades and worked perfectly. We also have Uridium Plus from 1987, which is kind of an odd thing. The story behind this specky version of Uridium Plus is that after Dominic Robinson finished work on the original conversion, he still had some more space to play with, so he got together with his design partner, John Cumming, and they knocked up a whole new set of levels in a weekend. Uridium Plus is the result of these labours, and this was released on the 4 Smash Hits compilation alongside Exolon, Synapse and Ranarama. Obviously the gameplay is virtually the same, only it's a whole bunch of new dreadnoughts named after chemical elements to destroy, and you can also land any time you want as opposed to waiting for the command to land now, although obviously doing that will mean scoring less points. This is a nice little treat for the folks who enjoyed the original, and it's also an entirely different set of levels to the ones that appeared on the Uridium Plus version for the C64. We've made it to the last game, and we're finishing on a high. It's another shooter, and it's Synapse from 1987. For this one, we stick with Dominic Robinson and John Cumming. However, Synapse is a ZX Spectrum original, which then got converted over to other micros like the C64 and Amstrad. The goal here is the usual shoot-'em-up norm of controlling a fighter, this one's called the Scorpion, and battling your way through the alien's planetary system, and the gameplay is a little Gradius-esque in that you pick up fuel with your fuel scoop, which you hold down the fire button to use, and then use that fuel to activate the fighter's weapon and propulsion systems. Simple stuff once you get the hang of it, and the result is definitely one of the better attempts at a horizontal shoot-'em-up on the ZX Spectrum. It's not quite on the level of all-time classics like the specky version of R-Type, but it's got a lot going for it, and it's nice to see Dominic Robinson, who did a fine job of converting various games like Uridium and Anarchy to the specky, scoring well with an original game for the computer. A great way to end the video. And with that, we have finished looking at Hewson's games for the Spectrum. Hopefully this video's not just done a good job of telling you all about these titles, but it's also done a good job of showing Hewson's history, as well as the history of some of the incredible talents that worked with them. They were a wonderfully consistent group with a lot of classics under their belt, and a legacy that's still very much alive today, whether it's in the many games that were inspired by the likes of Cybernoid and Paradroid, or directly in the work of Huey Games, run by Andrew Hewson and his son Rob, and makers of Hyper Sentinel, Uridium's spiritual follow-up. The large majority of games in this video are certainly worth playing, that's for sure, whether it's here on the Specky or on other platforms. So do yourself a favour and get some of these booted up today. Play a Hewson game. Right now. But before you do that, thanks for watching, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and bye for now.